The history of Africa is often told in fragments, shaped not by those who lived it, but by those who later wrote it down. For centuries, colonial scholars branded the continent the Dark Continent. This phrase, repeated in textbooks and classrooms, suggested emptiness, a land without monuments, without writing, without science. Yet the darkness was never Africa's own. It was a shadow cast deliberately, an erasure meant to diminish civilizations that once thrived across deserts, savannas, and river valleys. The myth began with explorers and historians who decided what counted as civilization. Greece, Rome, and Egypt became the golden pillars of human achievement, while equally advanced African empires were dismissed as accidents, anomalies, or worse, inventions. To admit their greatness would complicate a narrative that placed Europe at the center of progress. So, stone cities became mysteries, manuscripts were hidden in archives, and legends of astronomer kings or trading dynasties were buried beneath silence. But archaeological evidence refuses to stay buried. Across the continent, ruins and records tell a different story. In southern Africa, walls of stone rise in patterns so precise they defy easy explanation. In the West, manuscripts from Timbuktu speak of medicine, mathematics, and astronomy, long before Europe emerged from its own dark ages. In the north, Nubian pyramids stand in the desert, smaller but more numerous than those at Giza. These fragments whisper a truth too persistent to deny. Africa was never silent, never empty, never primitive. Still, the silence had consequences. Generations grew up believing Africa contributed little to world history, beyond serving as a backdrop for outsiders. This erasure is not just about the past. It reshaped identity, dignity, and the way nations saw themselves. To uncover the lost empires of Africa is not only to tell old stories, but to restore voices deliberately muted. And so, this journey begins not in Egypt or Greece, but in the heart of Africa, where empires rose, flourished, and rivaled the world's greatest powers. Their names are less familiar, their ruins less photographed, but their stories remain, waiting to be told. Among the most striking of these forgotten civilizations is the kingdom of Kush. When most people think of pyramids, the image that comes to mind is Egypt, towering monuments of Giza and grand pharaohs preserved in gold. Yet to the south, in the lands of modern-day Sudan, Kush thrived for over 1,000 years and left behind a legacy of its own pyramids, more than 200 of them, clustered in royal cemeteries and still standing in the desert today. Their steep sides and mathematical alignment testify to skill and vision equal to their northern neighbors. The Kushites were not simply imitators. At their height, they became Egypt's conquerors. In the 8th century BCE, Kushite kings marched north and established Egypt's 25th dynasty. They ruled as pharaohs, reviving pyramid construction, temple building, and Nile Valley architecture with their own unique blend of African spirituality and Egyptian symbolism. Their names, Piye, Taharka, Shabaka, resonate faintly in records, yet are rarely given the recognition they deserve. The capital city of Meroe became the empire's heart. Here, iron furnaces roared, producing tools and weapons centuries before much of Europe mastered such techniques. Vast water systems, called hafirs, stored rain for dry seasons, allowing life to thrive in harsh conditions. Inscriptions and art reveal a society not just surviving, but innovating. Oral traditions claim this knowledge came from divine instruction, while others hint at wisdom inherited from ancestors whose origins lay among the stars. Yet, despite its achievements, Kush was written out of mainstream history. Western scholars downplayed its power, categorizing its kings as mere footnotes to Egypt. Colonial archaeologists dismissed Meroe's ironworks and irrigation as accidents or borrowed techniques. School books reduced Kush to a name, if they mentioned it at all. In this way, an empire that rivaled Egypt was reduced to silence. In time, Kush fell, its decline hastened by environmental shifts and the rise of Aksum in the 4th century. Cities were abandoned, temples forgotten, and pyramids buried beneath desert sands. But the greater loss was not physical, it was historical. By neglect and distortion, the empire's brilliance was hidden from the world, leaving generations to believe that Africa's greatness began and ended on the Nile's northern banks. The kingdom of Kush reminds us that history is often shaped by who tells it, and sometimes what is not told is just as important as what is. Far to the south, in the rolling highlands of present-day Zimbabwe, another civilization rose, a city built from stone, so advanced and so vast that it defied the prejudices of colonial historians. This was Great Zimbabwe, a thriving metropolis that flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries, housing tens of thousands of people. At its heart stood the Great Enclosure, a massive stone wall that stretched hundreds of feet in circumference and soared nearly 40 feet high. Built without mortar, the walls were laid with such precision that they have withstood centuries of time, a testament to architectural genius. Great Zimbabwe was more than a fortress. It was a hub of commerce and culture. Archaeological evidence reveals a network of trade that reached across oceans, connecting this inland city to Persia, India, and even China. Gold, ivory, and iron flowed outward, while ceramics, glass beads, and silk traveled inward. Far from being isolated, Great Zimbabwe was woven into the fabric of global exchange. Its builders were mathematicians, engineers, and planners who mastered city design long before Europe recognized Africa's urban achievements. Yet, when Europeans first encountered its ruins in the 19th century, they refused to believe Africans could have built such grandeur. Theories spread that it was the work of Phoenicians, Arabs, or even biblical figures, anyone but the indigenous Shona people. This denial was no accident. To admit that Africans built a city of such sophistication threatened the colonial narrative of Africa as a land without civilization. So the truth was buried, the evidence dismissed, and Great Zimbabwe was treated as an anomaly, a mystery too inconvenient to accept. But radiocarbon dating, oral traditions, and archaeological digs tell another story. The ancestors of the Shona were the true builders. They mined gold, smelted iron, and planned their city with a precision that speaks of knowledge passed down through generations. Their mastery of dry stone architecture remains unmatched, and yet, in countless textbooks, Great Zimbabwe is either overlooked or relegated to a footnote. By the 15th century, the city was mysteriously abandoned. Scholars debate whether drought, resource exhaustion, or shifting trade routes brought its decline. Others suggest that external pressures, foreign influence, and growing interests from abroad destabilized the region. Whatever the reason, the city fell silent, its stones left standing as mute witnesses. But silence does not mean insignificance. Great Zimbabwe challenges us to see Africa's history not as empty spaces waiting to be discovered, but as a continent of builders, traders, and innovators. To erase Great Zimbabwe is to erase proof that Africa was shaping its own destiny long before colonizers arrived. To the west, on the edge of the Sahara Desert, another beacon of brilliance rose, Timbuktu. By the 14th century, this city had become the intellectual and spiritual crown jewel of the Mali Empire. It was a place where ideas flowed as freely as gold and where knowledge was considered wealth as valuable as any mine. Timbuktu housed universities and libraries filled with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts covering mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and law. Scholars from across Africa and beyond traveled here, creating an atmosphere of debate and discovery that rivaled the great centers of learning in Europe and the Middle East. This was no myth, though for centuries Western writers tried to paint Timbuktu as little more than a legend. In truth, it was a cosmopolitan hub where 25,000 students gathered in mosques and study halls. Within those manuscripts were discussions of planetary orbits and eclipse cycles, written with precision centuries before Western science confirmed them. Some texts even hinted at heliocentric models, suggesting a vision of the cosmos far ahead of its time. Timbuktu scholars were not just keeping pace with the world, they were leading it. At the heart of this empire was Mansa Musa, the ninth Mansa of Mali, whose wealth and power became legendary. When he made his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, he brought an entourage of tens of thousands with so much gold that its sudden influx into Cairo caused inflation lasting for over a decade. Economists today argue he may have been the richest individual in all of history, but his true legacy was not just wealth. It was the investment he poured into learning, trade, and cultural exchange, making Mali a crossroads of civilizations. And yet, the narrative of Mali's greatness was systematically downplayed. Colonial and later Western histories had little room for a black Muslim empire that surpassed European kingdoms in wealth and knowledge. Timbuktu was reduced to a footnote, its manuscripts locked away, many untranslated even today. To acknowledge Timbuktu's brilliance would be to admit that Africa was not a passive land awaiting discovery, but a continent shaping the course of human knowledge. Even more astonishing are the traditions of the Dogon people, who lived high in Mali's cliffs. Long before telescopes, they described with uncanny accuracy the orbit of Sirius B, a star invisible to the naked eye. Whether through inherited tradition, lost knowledge, or something else entirely, their astronomy remains one of history's great puzzles. Timbuktu and Mali remind us that empires are not measured by conquest alone. They are measured by ideas, by the ability to imagine, to calculate, to dream of the stars. And in that measure, Mali was a superpower of the mind. Further to the east, the highlands of Ethiopia gave rise to one of Africa's most enduring and enigmatic empires, Aksum. From the 1st century CE, the Aksumite Empire commanded power across the Red Sea corridor, controlling trade routes that linked Africa to India, Persia, and even China. It minted its own coins, built monumental stelae carved from single blocks of granite, and stood as a global player long before Europe ever looked toward the continent. To its people, Aksum was more than an empire. It was a kingdom blessed by divine favor. One of its most enduring legends lies in the Kebra Nagast, a manuscript written centuries later but rooted in ancient tradition. It tells of the union between King Solomon of Israel and the Queen of Sheba, and of their son Menelik, who brought the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. According to the tale, the Ark still resides in Aksum, hidden from the world, guarded by priests who never leave its side. Whether myth or reality, this story gave Aksum a sacred aura, one that shaped its identity for generations. Aksum's rulers were not just traders and kings. They were among the first to adopt Christianity as a state religion. Under King Ezana in the 4th century CE, Aksum converted, making it one of the earliest Christian empires in the world. Long before Europe's conversion, Ethiopia was already carving rock-hewn churches into solid stone, preserving sacred texts in Gaias and blending Judaic, African, and Christian traditions into a faith uniquely its own. In Lalibela, 11 monolithic churches were cut downward into bedrock, forming a sacred city said to mirror the New Jerusalem. Some researchers claim these structures emit resonant frequencies, suggesting they were more than places of worship. They were instruments of spiritual science. The architecture of Aksum was as astonishing as its spiritual vision. Its giant obelisks, some reaching over 100 feet tall, stood as markers of power and burial monuments for its rulers. These stelae were not crude stone towers, but intricately carved, with windows and doors etched into their surfaces as if they were models of multi-storied palaces. They were both symbols and mysteries, their construction still debated by archaeologists today. Yet Aksum's legacy was gradually overshadowed. As trade routes shifted and Islamic empires expanded across the Red Sea, Aksum's influence waned. Its great stele toppled, its records fragmented, and much of its history was buried beneath time. Colonial historians later ignored its significance, focusing instead on narratives that left Africa's past in shadow. But the stones of Lalibela still stand. The manuscripts in Gaias still exist. And in Aksum, the priests still guard the ark they say was carried from Jerusalem. Whether one believes in legend or in fact, the story of Aksum remains one of Africa's most powerful reminders that civilizations are more than ruins. They are ideas that continue to resonate across centuries. The story of forgotten African empires does not end with Kush, Zimbabwe, Timbuktu, Mali, or Aksum. They are only chapters in a much larger book, one written in stone, gold, manuscripts, and memory. Across the continent, traces of powerful kingdoms whisper from beneath the soil. Nok terracotta sculptures in Nigeria, Benin's bronze plaques that once adorned royal palaces, and the Swahili coast cities that connected Africa to Arabia and Asia through maritime trade. Each fragment reveals a truth hidden for centuries, that Africa was never a silent land waiting for discovery. It was already speaking, building, calculating, and shaping the world. And yet, much of this history was silenced. Colonial powers, intent on justifying conquest, spread the myth that Africa was a dark continent without civilization. When they found ruins like Great Zimbabwe, they credited them to outsiders. When they uncovered manuscripts in Timbuktu, they dismissed them as folklore. And when they encountered dynasties like Nubia, they rebranded them as mere extensions of Egypt. It was not that Africa lacked history, it was that its history was deliberately buried. But history has a way of resurfacing. Today, archaeologists, historians, and local storytellers are piecing together what was lost. Oral traditions once dismissed as myths are proving to be records of real events. Artifacts once ignored are now recognized as masterpieces. Entire libraries, like those of Timbuktu, are being preserved, digitized, and studied, revealing that Africa's scholars debated philosophy and charted the heavens long before Europe's Renaissance. The deeper truth is this: survival and greatness in Africa were never isolated acts. They were networks of ingenuity. Iron smelters in Meroe feeding trade, Shona builders stacking stones into cities, Malian astronomers mapping the stars, Aksumite kings carving their faith into rock, and Nubian queens commanding armies from the Nile. These were not anomalies. They were the heartbeat of civilizations that thrived for centuries. Even today, their legacy lingers. The unease we feel in the dark recalls humanity's long battles with predators. The symbols of lions, eagles, and serpents in modern culture echo ancient African reverence for nature's power. The resilience of African communities, passed through generations, is itself a living monument to empires once erased but never truly gone. To tell these stories is to reclaim them. To speak of Kush, Zimbabwe, Mali, Aksum, and Nubia is not only to remember, it is to restore balance. Africa's history was not silent, it was silenced, and now its voice is returning, stronger than ever. As the journey through Africa's forgotten empires draws to a close, the pace of the story softens, allowing the weight of history to linger in quiet reflection. Imagine the sands of Sudan covering Kushite pyramids, the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe standing firm under centuries of silence, the manuscripts of Timbuktu resting in dusty chests, the stelae of Aksum pointing skyward, and the echoes of Nubian chants carried by the Nile. These are not just remnants of a distant past. They are reminders of endurance. To be human is to endure, to remember, and to pass memory forward. The ancestors who faced lions, built cities, mapped stars, and carved stories into stone left more than ruins. They left resilience. And while history once tried to erase them, their legacies rise again, each discovery shining light into places once called dark. So, as the screen fades and silence returns, one truth remains: Africa's past is not lost. It waits, steady and patient, ready to be seen again by those willing to look deeper.